So welcome to week 3. In week 3 we're discussing risk management. We'll be identifying the components of risk management and then creating policies related to information security policy, governance, and risk management. So when you think about your own life and your own attitude to risk, you will appreciate that people have different attitudes and appetite, let's say, for risk. Some people are risk averse, and some people, not so much. And so we need to be able to reconcile these various perspectives on an event either occurring or not occurring for the purposes of ensuring that the organization is aware of its risk profile, its risk posture. How much risk is the organization willing to accept? You can never reduce risk to zero, of course. And so risk can be defined as the possibility of a person or entity suffering harm or loss because of an event. Now, in business, it's typically considered in terms of loss of revenue, but it's not always the loss. I mean, it may be reputation or goodwill or something less tangible. So it can also occur in security of the chance of an event. Let's say a hardware failure or a malicious disruption will occur, and so we need to have some sort of understanding of how we are quantifying, measuring risk in order to communicate that amongst each other and come up with a policy for that. So when we look at risk, we can know it's a little more nuanced than initially described, because there are strategic risks. That these are risks relating to adverse business decisions. So when you launch a new product, you don't know exactly it's going to be successful or not. There's a strategy involved in that, and you have to sort of be able to communicate and mitigate against certain types of harm. There are financial risks relating to, obviously, monetary loss, reputational risk relating to any negative public opinion or customer opinion. Operational risks relate to the loss of inadequate or failed processes or systems. Those are operational risks. Personnel risks relate to issues that affect morale, productivity, recruiting, and retention. So these are all personnel related risks relating to human beings in your organization. And then there are, of course, regulatory and compliance risks. These are regulations imposed by the legislature, and they relate to the cost of violating those rules. So, for example, there are many rules relating to privacy, and certain organizations are affected by requirements to have security procedures in place. And the failure to do that can result in a fine or penalty. And so those can be regarded as regulatory risk. So we have to, the process of risk management will examine or define the potential of an undesirable or unfavorable outcome resulting from a given action or activity, or in fact inaction. Right? What if we didn't do anything? Can this still affect us? And so when there is a new legislation, for example, or a new security threat, there is a risk that will have to be borne by someone in the organization. And what we need to try to figure out is, are the costs and benefits, or the trade-offs of mitigating that risk worth the potential avoidance of that particular harm occurring. So the managing of risk is something that businesses are continuously engaged because that implies that there are other actions that are being taken to mitigate the impact of the undesirable outcome or enhance the likelihood of a positive outcome taking place. When we refer to risk tolerance, then, that is how much of the undesirable outcome that the risk taker is willing to accept in exchange for a potential benefit. And depending on the type of organization that you're in and the maturity of that organization, the appetite or risk tolerance will be very, very different. So, for example, if you're a startup, you're an entrepreneur, your risk tolerance is very, very high. And the reason for that is that if you were overly concerned with mitigating and managing risk, you wouldn't move forward. But as organizations become more established, have larger budgets, there's a greater need for predictability. There's a greater intolerance for things going wrong, and therefore there is a greater need to mitigate and manage risk to ensure predictability. So in this lecture, we'll be discussing risk management. It's a key component of IT security policy. And before we start, what I want you to think about is your own personal attitude towards risk. There are certain people that are conservative in their with respect to risk, and we might call them risk averse, and other people not so much. But we have to figure out how to reconcile different perspectives on risk, appetite to risk, and exposure to risk if we are to create a good security program. And that's what this lecture is essentially about. So what we're going to be doing in this lecture is identifying the components of risk management and then creating policies related to information security policy, governance, and risk management. That's the goal. But first we'll start with a definition of risk. So risk can be defined as the possibility of a person or entity suffering harm or loss because of an event. For a business, the harm is often considered loss of money, revenue, but sometimes it can be reputational risk to the organization. So loss of goodwill, for example. You can describe risk alternatively as the chance of an event such as a hardware failure or malicious disruption occurring to a given organization. Now, that's what we're discussing when we discuss risk. Getting a little more specific, we might categorize different types of risk. Strategic risk relates to adverse business decisions, so decisions regarding the direction the organization takes. Financial risk relates to monetary loss. Reputational risk relates to a negative perception or public opinion. Operational risk relates to relates to loss resulting from inadequate or failed processes or systems. Personnel risk relates to people's individual morale, productivity, recruiting, and retention. And regulatory compliance risk relates to the violation of laws, rules, and regulations and policy. So we've got to be able to come up with a policy or a set of policies that manage all of these different types of risk. We need to understand the type of risk that we're dealing with and then the response within the organization as expressed in its policy. So risk management is also defined as the potential of an undesirable or unfavorable outcome resulting from a given action, activity or inaction. What we care about as managers, what management cares about, is the management of risk. This implies that other actions are being taken to mitigate the impact of the undesirable outcome or enhance the likelihood of a positive outcome. We talk a lot about how a business manages its risk, of which there are many. Our risk tolerance, then, is how much of the undesirable outcome the risk taker is willing to accept in exchange for a potential benefit. So companies that have a very low risk tolerance are going to be very, very conservative in their security posture. They are going to pay a premium for their security budget because their tolerance for risk is low. Whereas a startup or a small company may have a high risk tolerance simply because it doesn't have the budget or the resources to mitigate those types of risk. So why should you care about risk management? Well, think about what would happen if you personally didn't have any attitude towards risk. It's quite pathological actually, right? And so we've got to figure out how risk relates to security policies. So risk management is important enough to have its own standard, have its own ISO standard. So risk management is going to be a fundamental aspect of governance, decision-making, and policy within the organization. You can think about it as your perspective on security. So you should care about risk because if an organization fails to consider a risk, they could wind up with significant losses due to a lack of preparation. Security policies help manage security risks. But also, risk needs to be considered when designing policies. So every organization doesn't actually need the same policy because they're not likely to experience the same type of threats. So the threats for Microsoft are very different to a sole proprietor contracting company. Right? And so their security profile, their risk tolerance, is going to reflect this. Risk appetite is a strategic idea or construct defined as the amount of risk an entity is willing to accept in pursuit of its mission. Risk tolerance is a tactical and specific to a target. So it's the responsibility of the board of directors and executive management to establish the criteria for risk tolerance, to set acceptable levels of risk, and then disseminate this information to decision makers throughout the organization. That's the role of the board of directors. And they set the tone, essentially, with respect to risk. So here's an example of a risk management policy. Here it says that it assigns roles and responsibilities with respect to risk management. And the policy statement says, executive management in consultation with board of directors is responsible for determining the organizational risk appetite and risk tolerance levels. Right? And so we have a role for executive management. We have a role for the chief information officer. And in many companies, large companies, there will be a chief risk officer. And then you've got the board of directors as well. So they are involved with trying to think through the potential risks to business. So risk management is a comprehensive process that requires organizations to frame risk, to assess risk, to respond to risk once it's determined, and then to monitor risk on an ongoing basis using effective organizational communications and a feedback loop for continuous improvement of the risk-related activities of the organization. Risk management, then, is carried out as a holistic organization-wide activity. It's a big job within an organization to manage risk. Now, risk management is not going to be an exact science. Whether for information security risk or risk management in general, you cannot reduce risk to zero ever, because there are always going to be threats that you haven't anticipated.
But what it does do is that it brings together the best collective judgments of individuals and groups responsible for the strategic planning, oversight, management, and day-to-day operations. So it's necessary to understand this because it will help you develop your security management program, because it provides the risk response measures that will be in place to protect the mission and business function. That's what we are trying to accomplish. It's not perfect. It's not entirely methodologically rigorous, but it is a way of having people understand what is important within an organization and how to prioritize in response in creating a security posture. So we've got to figure out how we're going to frame risk. Framing risk cannot be done without the context. So what we've got to do is produce a risk management strategy that makes explicit and transparent the risk perceptions used in making decisions. And this is not always straightforward because sometimes people don't know that they have a risk. In fact, they just weren't aware of a regulatory rule, for example, that they have to comply with, or they may not be aware of a particular security threat or vulnerability. So the framing of risk establishes a foundation for managing risk. Framing risk requires an identification of the risk assumptions. That is to say, what are the assumptions about the threats, vulnerabilities, and consequences, likelihood of occurrence? Those are assumptions we're going to try to figure out how to put either quantifiable or qualitative input around. Are there any risk constraints on the conduct of risk response and monitoring? You could, for example, do keystroke logging to make sure that all employees are safe, quote unquote. But that would result in a trade-off or a negative impact on employee morale and violate their privacy as well. So it's not something you would want to consider unless you were dealing with a highly sensitive work environment. Risk tolerance deals with, when we frame risk tolerance, we're interested in either the level, the type, or degree of acceptable uncertainty. What degree of uncertainty are we willing to tolerate? For certain people, that's going to be quite narrow. For others, maybe not so much. They can deal with the ambiguity much better. Framing risk also needs to make an assessment as to what the priorities are and what the trade-offs are. All decisions come with trade-offs. And so understanding what they are, accepting them, accepting the consequences of them, will help you move forward. So we need to think about the relative importance of business functions, trade-offs, among different types of risk, timeframes in order to address risk. Right? And people have very different attitudes toward that, depending on their level of commitment to the organization, of course, right? So people have a vested interest in ensuring that their job function continues, but that's not necessarily the most important thing within an organization. So it's hard to balance sometimes. So how are we going to frame risk? We need to think about our risk assumptions. We've got to think about our risk constraints. We've got to think about risk tolerance and the priorities and trade-offs. The purpose of a risk assessment then is to essentially put risk in context of the business and frame them and framing outlined in the last step. So our purpose is to identify threats to the organization, vulnerabilities, harm, and the likelihood that this event occurring. Some people use the term hazard to describe threats and vulnerabilities. Slightly different language, but it essentially means the same thing. What's the risk profile? What's the risk context? Residual risk are things that your level of risk after all of the things you've tried to control for, right? It reflects the actual state. So there's sort of residual risk can be thought of as a margin for error. Residual risk then is takes into account the controls that have been designed to be put in place. Risk assessments then should develop realistic threat scenarios and then focus on those that are going to disrupt the business. You've got to direct them towards the mitigation of loss of productivity. This might include loss of staff, physical location, materials, data, for example. Things to remember when you're mitigating risk is whether the hazard is statistically significant or whether the hazard has been sufficiently addressed with satisfactory precautions or mitigations. The need to consider what mitigations currently eliminate or minimize risk. So we need to think about what do we currently have in place. You want to be able to support your risk assessment. You need to identify how you planned to assess the risk, what tools or methodologies you use, what assumptions that you made, who are the key people and their roles and responsibilities, the frequency of risk assessment. You're going to review this maybe once a year, for example, and how the hazard information is obtained. How the potential for harm was understood by the organization. So that means you want to have a policy here. Right? So an information security risk assessment policy will assign responsibility for and set parameters for the conducting of information risk assessments. That's what there's a policy to create and set parameters on risk. So you're going to do your analysis, do your risk analysis, and then provide those results and recommendations to the executive management and board of directors in order for them to make decisions around the risk profile and ultimately risk policy. Risk and business impact is important because you've got to consider the impact the event will have on the organization. So another way of putting it, if a hazard happened, what would the impact to the business be? So you've got to think about, let's consider two of the following hazards, each of which may have a similar chance of occurring. Hardware failure of my laptop, let's say, or a failure of a network at Ontario Tech for a few hours. Both will have the same impact, actually. I can't use my laptop. But the business impact of each of those occurring is, very different, right? So if my laptop fails, then, it's just my laptop. But if the network goes down, then that's everybody's laptop. So understanding that there's, one hazard and, having a greater importance and priority than another. A business impact analysis determines the impact business disruptions have on the organization. Right? So, it looks at the outcome of the information gathered and provides metrics. Right? So you might say, an impact analysis will discuss the impact that disruptions will have, let's say, for informational websites or core processing systems, the tolerance of downtime by system basis, how much downtime can your marketing database have versus your email system? Can you prioritize critical business processes in case of disruption, which parts of the organization are more important than others, and then what are the resource requirements for restoring time-critical processes. Part of the process of information gathering for a business impact assessment will be one-on-one interviews with subject matter experts. You can brainstorm across the organization, you can meet with different people, which offer, they all offer a different perspective. You can use formal or semi-formal questionnaires that can be compared. You can ask quantitative questions, such as, the impact in terms of lost revenue, lost sales, interest, penalties, the cost of emergency services. And then you can also ask qualitative questions, such as, what would it mean in terms of, which are the most important customers? How will employee confidence be affected if a network goes down, for example, or you are monitoring employees, let's say. So part of the initial step of business impact assessment is to identify the realistic hazards. You've got to assess the risks of the organization in terms of statistical chance of the hazard occurring, as well as the ramifications of that, should that occur. Right? This is going to be, a key component to the due diligence of an organization to have anticipated the likelihood of an event occurring. So the most likely and serious hazard inform the priority of which security policies and mitigations you're going to put in place. Octave is a risk management process, which stands for Operationally Critical Threat, Asset, and Vulnerability Education. It was created by Carnegie Mellon University. It's sort of a flexible and simple process that's easily adaptable depending on the size, type, and complexity. Organizations can make use of that to determine their protection decisions, and they're almost entirely based on the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of critical information-related assets. That's what we want to make available. That's what we want to protect. That's what we have a low tolerance of risk for. Octave has 3 phases. It's usually conducted by an analysis team whose role is to conduct the assessment. In the first phase, we have to create an asset-based threat profile for the organization. And then, we are going to identify vulnerabilities and then develop a strategy. So the first part is creating an asset-based profile. Here you're going to identify the assets of the organization, what currently is being done by the organization to protect those assets, and then selecting those assets that are important within the organization that are considered critical for them. Then you could create a threat profile for each. Second phase of an infrastructure, the second phase of Octave is infrastructure vulnerability identification. So we want to make an evaluation of the information infrastructure, how that is conducted. We've got to identify the key components and physical assets that either support or process the critical information related assets. And then we've got to evaluate selected components and assets as far as resistance to threats and vulnerabilities and their ramifications. Third phase is developing a security strategy. So we're going to be conducting a risk analysis, so creating a set of impact evaluation criteria that's defined by the organization and establish a common basis for determining the impact value, high, medium, or low, and then developing any and all risks that are evaluated for their impact. Then we're going to lastly develop a protection strategy for the organization. This is going to focus on improving security practices and provides a plan for mitigating the impact of the risks to the critical assets. So just in terms of a summary, we've got to think about the threat and vulnerability, and then the risk determination. Lastly, we have to think about what our risk response is. So once we've identified the risk, we've got to apply our mitigations. So we have to implement policies and technological mitigations that will minimize their impact, and then or say whether or not we can simply accept the risk, decide that they are within an acceptable level of our risk tolerance, and be okay with that. There are different types of risk mitigations. These can range from risk reduction, so implementing countermeasures, risk sharing, so risk sharing with another entity. You can't do that for compliance with most regulations. In fact, you can't share that risk if it's your responsibility. You can transfer the risk, for example, through insurance. You can avoid the risk by either modifying or ceasing the risk related activity, or you can do a number of a combination of those things. So here's another policy from the textbook. You have an information security risk response policy, and there you're going to be defining the risk response requirements and authority. So if you look at the policy statement, the results of the risk assessment are provided to the executive management and the business process owner within 7 days of completion. That's this particular policy. So certain low risks can be signed off by the business process owner, but if they're elevated or heightened level of risk, then you want that approved by usually chief information security officer or even the CEO of the organization. Monitoring risk is going to be an ongoing process here. We need to monitor risk on an ongoing basis. Some risks need to be periodically reassessed. And then we've got to consider whether or not we change our risk, our security profile in response to events that have occurred, such as high-profile hacks. We may consider, okay, well, we need to beef up our security or apply some other mitigation strategy. So in terms of the task, we've got to identify the risk. We've got to think about the alternatives. We've got to put forward a response decision, and then we've got to implement that ultimately. We are going to engage in a monitoring strategy and then ongoing monitoring for the organization. So in terms of summary questions, these are questions that you can use for review. First question is, why do we need to frame risk? What information do we need to consider in a risk assessment? And how does risk assessment help inform an organization's security policy, design, and implementation? And lastly, what is Octave? What is that about? What does it stand for? And what are its phases? Those are things you can use when you're reviewing this lecture. Thanks very much, and I'll see you in the next session.